All right, guys, we're bottom of the hour. We should get started. I don't know if you guys want to move up, or if you're like, scared of me, or I'm going to wander around like a television evangelist and bestow blessings and things. So, critical infrastructure, identity. Shall the twain meet? Maybe that should have been the title of the talk. I thought I'd start off by just saying that I've worked in this space for in the critical infrastructure and control system space for quite a while, and so probably half of my career was in control systems and robotics, and then the other half was in security with identity kind of at the beginning of it, or at the end, last part now when I'm at ForgeRock. So I'm coming at this with some, I would say, personal frustration about how slow the critical infrastructure area changes. And so I thought I'd just educate you a little bit on where it's at and what I think could be done in this space. So I don't know where everybody's coming from, but I thought I'd spend just a couple slides going to understand, what we're talking about here. So start with control systems. You have them in your house. Control system basically manages what they call process variables. In this case, the thermostat in your house, the process variable is your house temperature. And it measures the house temperature, it compares it to a set point, and it turns on your heating or cooling if you have it to try to keep your house in that temperature. Pretty straightforward. They get a lot more complicated. So they've been evolving, and these old mechanical ones, that one on the bottom left actually used a bimetal spring, and then believe it or not, there's about a half cc of mercury inside of it that wets two contacts to turn your heater on and off. So that became digital, I think, probably partially just to get rid of the mercury, I don't know. And eventually, they became connected. And that's where things get interesting, because suddenly they're on a network and they're attackable and all that. And this is sort of a vignette of what's been happening in the controls industry for a couple of decades at least. So next word, operational technology. You can think of these as control systems that manage, in particular, industrial processes and equipment. There's a lot of terms that float around in the industry. It's a fairly parochial industry. Here's some terms here. You've probably heard of industrial control systems or SCADA systems. There's lots of terms. For the purpose of this talk, they all mean the same thing. So what's critical infrastructure then, and why should we care? Well, CISA is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, part of DHS. They define it this way, and I think the key takeaway on this is it's the cyber devices that, if they're disrupted, they have an incredible impact on our society, our national security, and so on. So that's that's why I'm interested in it. Both because it's an interesting technical problem, and because I have to live with our electricity and our water and all that good stuff. So I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of slides here. CISA divides critical infrastructure into 16 sectors, and I'm just going to go through those now. The key thing to remember here is that each of these sectors often grew up in their own space. They have their own nomenclature, expertise, protocols, and so on. And so it makes it a lot harder to start to use standards in this space. You can see, defense industrial base would be like the company I worked for many years, Boeing, was part of the DIB, or just defense industrial base. Energy generation, transmission, distribution, all of that. The other thing to remember with all these is that they're not disjoint, they have interdependencies, which makes things even more interesting. So that's the 16 sectors. I'll add that at IAW a few weeks back, I met a guy, Ken Gant, from, he was in DHS, he was the vice director, deputy director of biometric identity, I think. He's advocating actually adding a 17th sector, which he just calls identity, which I think is kind of an interesting idea. I don't know if it quite makes sense, but it's worth watching. So my hypothesis is that we can bring in modern identity standards into the operational technology and critical infrastructure systems and help bridge what is often called an IT-OT divide. And I'll talk about that a little more. So I'm hoping I'll convince you of that in the rest of the slides. So OT and critical infrastructure have what I call a long tail problem. There's literally hundreds of legacy protocols out there because all these sectors grew up in their own space. So what protocols are used depends on the vendor, on the sector. It's kind of the Wild West in a lot of ways, at least from an IT perspective. Many of these protocols are incompatible with standard IT systems. So you often see protocols that communicate over Ethernet, but they don't use IP. So isn't that an interesting thing from an IT perspective? And yeah, cross-vendor interoperability is almost an anti-pattern in a lot of ways from my perspective. It's still, I think, competitively, there's a fair amount of advantage to not interoperating with your competitor. At least that's my perception. Others might disagree. Another challenge is the life cycles. So, you have a typical IT life cycle of 3 to 5 years. It's decades. I mean, how often do you replace your power plant, right? I mean, it could be 50 years or even more. So that actually kind of slows progress, right? And historically, from a security perspective, they have always depended on isolation as the primary protection mechanism. This has led in the last decade or so to what I call the Mythical Air Gap. There's a lot of pressures to interconnect these things, and that's sort of there's good reasons to do it, and it has bad effects, like you saw with the thermostat. So there's a lot of pressure to have this connectivity between, say, your corporate IT systems and your OT, your critical infrastructure systems. And the drivers really come around from visibility, operational expense, harvesting efficiencies, and so on. And it really started in the late 90s. I saw this at Boeing. I worked in a lot of worked on protecting factory systems, manufacturing systems. And then I chose the word accelerants here for a reason, because it is like throwing fuel on the fire of the challenges we have in this space. There's a growing need for remote support, and it's because it's hard. There's so many specialties in here, and you got to have good people doing this stuff, or the lights don't stay on. More and more, we're seeing SaaS services offered to these things, so that's another form of connectivity out through the public internet. There's a growing use of real-time data lakes and data harvesting from that. And there's an interesting intersection going on with IoT and industrial IoT, like home automation. Again, there's a lot of value to it, but there's also a lot of risk that it brings in terms of attack surface. So the way that this stuff works has worked over time. You can see these different colored regions. Boy, this is a really dim pointer, sorry. These different colored regions are called zones. And generally, everything within a zone has implicit trust of everything else in that zone. So it's like a group of assets that have, say, some similar or related functionality. And then interconnecting those zones are what's called conduits. Conduits are basically interconnections, and you can see these little brick firewalls here. That's how they protect these different zones from each other. There's some challenges with that. I'll add that this architecture came out of the International Society for Automation Committee 99. There's several specs there. They were incrementally transferred into ISO IEC into the 62443 specs. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I would encourage it. Let's see. Really what this is a network segmentation model. Those of you who've done security for many years, you probably remember that term. It's, it works, but it doesn't. The firewalls have challenges and so on. I'll get into some of those. So why do we need to change it, in my opinion? I think, we're aware of some issues that have been, that have come up in the news, the Colonial Pipeline, for example, and things like that. But the reality is there's a lot more going on that none of us hear about. And so I really like this survey from about a year ago. They surveyed 900 companies across manufacturing and electric utilities, oil and gas, in the US, Germany and Japan. And the questions were really around cyber attack experiences that they've had in the previous 12 months. And the results were that 44% of these companies had disruptions due to cyber attack. They were balanced across the OT and IT systems, but really, because they're more connected than ever today, either one of those, in fact, the Colonial Pipeline was an attack on an IT system, not the low-level parts of running the pipeline. But it still took out the operations and caused fuel spikes and fuel price spikes and so on. The average damage is close to 3 million. I'd love to see the distribution of that curve. It could be that some of them were hundreds of million, and there were a few that were $10. I don't know. I would love to see that curve. And I love this, that when in these questionnaires, the top reason to improve their security was because they don't want it to happen again. So that really means we're still in reactive mode here, which is not really a good thing. There we go. So identity-related challenges. Let's tie it into the topic of the conference. So there's two levels to this. One is at the user and operator level. We have an increasing rate of employee churn, third parties, contractors, and so on coming and going, and that results in account and entitlement changes. However, most of this equipment today still uses username password with a local password store, if they use any passwords at all. Or they might use it, like in this little control center here, there might be just a shared password that everybody uses. That's pretty common. And part of the reason for that is safety. They need to be able to get into these systems really fast if something is going wrong and they need to intervene. So that's something to think about, and I think there's some things we can do there in identity. So enough said on that. So now let's look at the device level for a minute. You saw those zones, and in my opinion, there's too much trust within the zones. For example, if somebody accidentally or nefariously adds a new device into a zone, it has access to everything in that zone. It's trusted. The static firewall-based rules, these systems are evolving faster. I mean, some of them are pretty static, like, you build a pipeline, you're not going to be making a lot of wild config changes in terms of your network topology and what talks to what. But other systems, not so much. And the static firewall rules are basically MAC IDs and IP addresses, if you're lucky. So there's also a lack of use of standard device onboarding that is secure. There's some standards out there. The one I'm particularly interested in is called FIDO device onboarding, or FDO. Yes. I haven't seen a lot of uptake in it yet, but this is a protocol donated by Intel to the FIDO Alliance. And there are other protocols out there. I've done work in standards and trusted computing group around some of these things, but the basic idea is that you want to be able to, when you're ready to plug in a device, you want to know where it came from and its sort of heritage, if you will, and that it's configured in running what you think it is. So that is into a lack of software bill of materials inventory. We need that to know what's running on the device. There are standards out there. They're starting to be used in the IT space. I'm not seeing much in the OT space. Siemens is the only one I've seen that is even participating in some of the standards, but I haven't seen any mention of it in their products. And then last, if you really want to get fancy, we really should be looking at health attestation. This is the old secure boot, if you're familiar with that, where there's a secure enclave on a device, and it's used to measure before run every step of the way as a device boots up. And those measurements can then be demanded by a peer device, and there's no way for it to be, because of certificates on the secure enclave, it can attest to its state, and even if it's been attacked, it can't lie about it. Well, it can lie about it, but it'll be obvious. So those are some of the things that are lacking today. So what's in our toolbox? You know, we've got all these great standards, right? Problem solved. Walk away. No, not so fast. We need to understand the limitations of operational technology as a domain. One of the things when you start in security is you learn about the holy triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And in this space, those are often the order of priority. And in this space, it's often availability, integrity, and then confidentiality. So that really means you got to rethink about how you apply a lot of the security principles that we're used to in the IT domain. So another thing is that OT systems are often very delay intolerant. If you have, for example, let's say I have a control system running on a millisecond control loop. This is very common in motion control or velocity control, say in a printing plant or something. If you have to go out, if a device has to go out and do a refresh cycle on an OAuth2 token, you know, they were talking, 100 milliseconds or more. That is not a good thing. They are not happy with that. These OT systems use standard IT components, but not in a standard way. I learned that firsthand at Boeing. I loaded a service pack, so the human machine interfaces run something like Windows NT or whatever, right? And I thought, I was helping set up a new moving line controller for the 777 line in Everett. And oh, well, gee, service pack 3's out, let's load it. I did that. I turned it into a brick. I had to have the integrator come out, flatten the entire system, and reload it. Fortunately, we weren't in production yet, but lesson learned. So really, any use of identity standards, we have to adapt to the requirements of the OT domain. Zero trust. I shouldn't need to educate people on what that is in this group, but I just wanted to emphasize about continuous evaluation of trust. And zero trust architecture involves all these different things. These are some things you can read about if you're so interested. Particularly the bottom one you may not be aware of. There's a new revision coming out, so have at that if you want to get educated. These slides should all be posted as well. So what would I like to see? This is, if everybody listened to me, if I was the person in charge. I think the goal would be both the security and the interoperability of these systems, and to leverage IT standards as best we can, keeping in mind that OT systems, there may be specific profiles or ways you use these devices and use the protocols just required because of the domain. So what I like to see in provisioning, I'd like to see the manufacturers include signed certificates from them embedded in the device before they leave the factory. And then let the operator do what they want once they deploy them. Authentication, I'd like to see the devices authenticate any communications incoming and outgoing, be it other devices, people, or services. Authorization, I'd like to see a system-level authorization policy. Instead of these firewalls scattered hither and thither, have a central authorization policy that can be changed and propagated out to the enforcement points. This is kind of zero trust stuff, right? Logging and audit, the OT domain has, I often call them, what's the term they use? I can't remember right now. It's the data historian. It's logging, folks, and especially when you're crossing OT/IT, it'd be really nice to be consolidating your logs and being able to do intelligent detection of threats and not keep it siloed. So for user security, I think, I mentioned that there's some not great practices out there today. We have these fast access requirements. We also, if you see this device on the right, that thing's about maybe, 10 centimeters by 4, to give you an idea of size. There's no way for somebody to log into that. So that's a challenge. But if we had strong authentication, you could have much finer grained access controls, and you could improve the auditing, which is important in this space. Particularly, many of these spaces are highly regulated. So I think FIDO offers some interesting possibilities there, particularly if you had near field and Bluetooth Low Energy for devices like this. You could basically hold your authentication token up to it, and it can know who you are. So I think there's some good possibilities there. I know of only one vendor, Schneider Electric, who started doing some FIDO authentication in their human-machine interface stuff. There may be others. Tell me if so, I'd love to know. So how can all these ideas help? These aren't a cure-all. There's some very sophisticated people out there attacking this infrastructure. Nation states, terrorists, ransomware, extortionists, and so on. But I think we actually can improve the security posture a lot in this space. It's going to take a lot of time, though. Another thing to keep in mind is that OT cyber attacks come in through the supply chain. And so the best practices that are developed need to propagate up into the supply chain. So what can you do to help? Last slide. So the people who are running these systems, raise the bar with your manufacturers, OEMs, integrators on what you expect. For the people making these devices, look to apply these identity and security standards into your product lines. Granted, it's going to take some time. And also learn from your customers and what their challenges are. Too oftentimes, I think it's easy for people to develop a product and just keep delivering it, right? But learn from your customers. For identity professionals, there's a lot of you need a deep understanding of this space to really have a voice at the table, and there's lots of training opportunities. I'll just quickly mention CISA. Many years ago, I did a week-long training course at Idaho National Labs. This was back when I was at Boeing. And it was basically 3 days of training in a classroom, followed by 2 days of red team, blue team on a simulated, I think it was a water plant, something like that they had everything from soup to nuts there. And that was the most fun I've had in a long time. To try to defend or attack these systems. You learn a lot that way. You also make a lot of friends. Also, I think we need more participation in the standards communities, particularly ISA, International Society for Automation. I'm starting a conversation with with the current co-chairs of ISA 99 committee. We'll see where that goes. What I'd like to see is a new work group stood up that starts attacking this from, say, a zero trust perspective. And I think they're receptive to it. I actually know both of them, so I'm not coming like, who's this guy? So, repeating my hypothesis, I hope I've convinced you that this hypothesis has legs, let's say, and the way forward. It's going to take a lot of time. One of the things I'm most irritated about in this space is, I started working in it about 25 years ago. If we'd started then, we'd be a lot further along than we are now. So it's really time for the conversation to start, and then we can see where it leads. That's all I've got for you. Right on time. Is Andre here? The following. No, yeah, I take questions. I just want to make sure I leave time for the next speaker, Andre from IC Consult. He's supposed to speak next, as I understand it, but maybe not. Questions? Sure. Go ahead.
You mentioned that there are cloud-based services for the OT environment.
Yep.
And you found that the OT folks themselves are willing to accept those, are being considered cloud not reliable.
Yeah. So the question is really around the cloud services and whether whether you can really trust them as an operator when availability is sort of number one, right? So, I think they are getting a lot of traction. I think particularly for logging. So not for critical operation, like if the connection to the cloud fails, the system goes down. So that's where it's starting, but it's going to continue. You'll see more and more of it because everybody wants this recurring revenue model, right? There was another question somewhere.
Yeah, so you just said you entered that industry 25 years ago, so the best point in time to start doing that was 25 years ago.
Right.
The second best is right now, and we're lagging behind. The problem that I see is that most of the industry is either stuck in medieval times, and that's not true maybe in Renaissance.
Yes.
When I start talking to those vendors and those PLCs about X509 certificates and stuff like that, say, what? Microsoft's doing lots of stuff with OPC UA into the standard. It's nice that all of them do speak OPC UA, but none of them actually have implemented technology, how to, get certificates, maintain certificates, life cycle certificates. So there's so much work.
There is, and it's going to take time.
And I think the most important part that you mentioned is that the customer, that the users of that technology, they need to put much more pressure on the vendors. Say,
yes.
We want more secure technology, and now comes the bad part of it. We are
raise the bar, right? Yes.
On one of the slides.
Yes.
But it's
yes.
really like not asking for more security, but keeping the price stable. Well, the vendors have to do lots of work to get it done. So
it's going to take work, and you think about things like when these things are deployed, they have to be certified in a lot of these environments, and you don't just go willy-nilly and change. Oh, now I'm going to use 509 certs, right? No. So yeah, it is going to take a long time. Interesting in OPC UA, I have a good friend, actually he reviewed the slides for me, who's working on that committee now, but I still feel like it's too focused in that we need to look at this from an architectural level as well. So, other questions? Sure.
No, so I'm glad you actually mentioned about the certification stuff, because that's something that can change in environments, you can pass it in many cases, especially when you validate the certification. One thing I didn't really talk about was the run regulation.
Yes.
In a lot of cases, the regulations that come in that impact this as well.
Well, and in fact, the regulations today can sometimes get in the way. I mean, if I remember right, there's something in NERC SIP for the electric utilities that requires usernames and passwords. And that was a great requirement back when people weren't using them at all, but we can do better than that today. So yeah, there has to be an adaptation of the regulation over time. That takes a lot of time too.
There's action coming. Cyber Resiliency Act review.
Yes.
A massive impact on
Yeah.
these environments, but that's an EU, it's not global.
Yeah. I think I had my email address. If you guys are interested, any of you are interested in continuing this conversation, I would heartily encourage you to reach out. I'd like to have more people reaching out on the in terms of talking to ISA 99 in particular. So that's all I got.